Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of Faith and Feelings. We are in the middle of a series on anxiety, and for the next 2 weeks, we are going to be talking about triggers. When I think about the term trigger and how often it's being referenced in conversations today, 2 words immediately come to mind: overused and misunderstood. And that is a dangerous combination. Today, the term trigger has become a buzzword and is often thrown around casually and almost jokingly, or as an excuse to not do hard things. Sadly, I've seen how the overuse of this word has caused the powerful nature of triggers to be underestimated. When I think about my own personal experiences with triggers, coupled with what I've learned in my current work in clinical mental health counseling, I've also noticed some common misconceptions about people who experience them. I want to be clear: experiencing a trigger is not an emotional failing. Being triggered doesn't mean that you're weak, sensitive, or fragile. Triggers are real, and experiencing a trigger simply means that you're human. We are going to dive deeper into what this means today, so before we do, I want to briefly highlight 3 kinds of people that this episode is specifically for. First, this episode is for you if you are well aware of your triggers and have some general knowledge about what they are, but feel like you are on the losing side of your battle with them. You might have started listening to this episode with hopes of learning some practical ways to cope with triggers. Keep listening. Second, this episode is for anyone who knows they've been triggered before, but they've struggled to pinpoint exactly what their triggers are. If this is you, you might feel frustrated or confused about how triggers are actually formed. And finally, this episode is for you if you're listening but feel a little skeptical about this topic in the first place. Maybe you're wondering if triggers are real and want to learn more about the psychology behind them. If any of these descriptions sound like you're in the right place. So let's jump in. I want to begin this conversation by defining what a trigger is, but I'm going to start by defining what it is not. Being triggered isn't the same as being overwhelmed or uncomfortable. Being triggered isn't just about something rubbing you the wrong way. It is completely normal in the course of everyday life to feel upset or distressed. Rather, when someone is triggered, it means they are having a strong, reflexive reaction to something that wouldn't ordinarily cause that response. At its heart, triggers are reactions to past trauma. They are the result of how our brains have processed and filed these painful experiences and memories. When we are triggered, our bodies are sending us reminders of something painful or confusing that happened to us in the past and that is affecting our present. Although there are common triggers, anything can be a trigger. And that's because triggers result from our individual experiences layered with how we uniquely interpret them. They are extremely personal. And this isn't meant to be isolating, but encouraging. As we reflect on our stories, it's so important to honor rather than diminish or judge how our bodies and brains have tried their very hardest to help us and keep us safe. This is really important to remember as we talk about triggers and how to respond to them in an effective way. Now, if you're like me, you'd much prefer to lock up all your feelings in a box and deal with them when it's most convenient. Unfortunately, as we both know, people don't work that way, and neither do feelings. we can experience the full range of emotions at any time, whether we are prepared to cope with these emotions or not. So, if we can be triggered without forewarning, what are we supposed to do about them? And how can we begin to more quickly identify when we're feeling triggered? Understanding how triggers form and what they feel like can be incredibly helpful in creating a strategy for healthy coping. So let's process some answers to both of those questions together. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, triggers are powerful. When we are triggered, it can often feel like our bodies and brains are arguing with each other. These experiences can feel incredibly frustrating because the parts of our brains that can process information logically and linearly shut down, or in other words, seem to go completely offline. It can feel impossible to think coherently as our bodies can either become numb or instantly thrust into a tense or heart-pounding, high alert state. But our bodies and brains actually aren't fighting. They are very much so communicating with each other. If you remember one thing from this episode, I want you to remember this. When you are triggered, your body and brain are not out of alignment. Rather, your body is reacting according to something that your brain has flagged as a source of danger. Remember how I just mentioned that triggers are a response to past trauma? Let's unpack this a little further, as I think it will be helpful in making some connections between past traumatic experiences and current triggers. When we live through traumatic experiences, our brains are actively at work. In order to protect us from similar experiences in the future, our brains are constantly scanning the horizon, taking in things around us that are causing the greatest threat, and literally encoding these things deep into our subconscious as sources of danger. But in traumatizing moments, our brains aren't just taking note of the most obvious and identifiable threats. They are also collecting thousands of other seemingly random pieces of stimuli at the same time. Imagine with me that a woman named Lily was in a serious bike accident as a child. When the accident happened, Lily's brain was making powerful associations between riding a bike and pain. But that's not it. Lily's brain was taking in hundreds of other stimuli from this event. The foggy weather that day, the smell of the Mexican restaurant across the street, the color of the shirt that she was wearing, the specific intersection where the accident occurred. These associations are stored in Lily's brain, along with the corresponding emotions, helplessness, panic, and confusion from that day. And these connections aren't stored in Lily's brain with full stories. For example, her brain didn't encode the logical connection between the smell of tacos and her bike accident. It might simply encode tacos, danger. So years later, when Lily is at the airport and passes a Mexican restaurant on her way to her gate, she suddenly feels uneasy or off without being able to pinpoint why. But her brain has recognized a connection that it has flagged with life or death importance, and it is reflexively shooting out what it believes to be an appropriate emotional response. These reflexive emotional responses might manifest in big ways, like a panic attack, or they might manifest in smaller ways, like feeling grumpy, getting overwhelmed, acting defensively, or crying. Now, none of this, of course, is reasonable. But your brain isn't trying to be reasonable. It's trying to save your life. And this is why triggers are so individual and can feel so random. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, triggers are formed from how our brains have processed painful experiences. They are not just about remembering past pain, but re-experiencing past pain as if it were happening in the present. and they can often be connected to a traumatic experience that doesn't appear to be so obvious at first. Briefly interrupting this episode to invite you to the Faith and Feelings Substack, a weekly Wednesday email and reader's favorite that allows us to continue the conversation we start here on the podcast. These emails include personalized resources, recommended links, and reflection questions designed to help you process each week's episode more deeply, both individually and in community. Click the link in this episode's show notes to become a paid subscriber for just $5 a month and begin investing in your own spiritual and emotional health today. Let's move on to the types of triggers that we can experience. Essentially, there are two types of triggers: internal and external. Internal triggers come from inside of a person. It can be a memory, a physical sensation, or an emotion. To make this practical, I want to illustrate an internal trigger through a personal example. A few years ago, I was at a friend's house spending the afternoon with a group of people who I had just recently met. Everyone was talking and having a good time, but towards the beginning of the afternoon, there were a couple times where I found myself standing alone. As I looked around, everyone else seemed engaged in conversation with at least one other person. The longer I stood by myself in the corner of the room, the more awkward and alone I felt, along with this powerful sensation that seemed to come out of nowhere. My body started getting hot and my hands started to sweat. I started emotionally withdrawing without understanding why. I couldn't seem to come back into the moment. And the longer I lingered on the outside of this social gathering, the less capable I felt of re-entering. Shutting down, I felt like my ability to engage in a normal conversation had been completely severed. The more I sensed myself withdrawing, the more alone I felt, which simply perpetuated the cycle. I remember thinking, "What's wrong with me? I feel so awkward." Later that evening, I was driving home and called my mom. When she asked how my day was going, I burst into tears. Although I couldn't name what had triggered me that day or that I had even been triggered, I kept thinking about that afternoon. As I reflected on what was happening around me and in me, I slowly began to make some connections between some experiences that I'd had of being bullied as a child soon after my family moved cross-culturally. Those feelings of loneliness, social anxiety, and awkwardness had triggered memories of exclusion and cultural confusion as a child. As trauma therapist Kobe Campbell explains, triggers validate our negative core beliefs and shock us back into the biological environment of our deepest wounds. Even though that situation had been completely different from my childhood experiences, my brain hadn't separated the two. Rather, it had encoded these specific feelings as threatening, and any time I felt them again, my brain was actively trying to tell me, "The last time you felt these specific feelings, it didn't go too well for you." And my body proceeded to respond accordingly with a shut-down emotional response. Do you see how this personal example wasn't necessarily catastrophic? Most of the bullying happened with other 10-year-olds on a playground. But these painful experiences had overwhelmed my 10-year-old nervous system in a way that shaped my perception of my future ability to engage and find my place in group settings. Some common internal triggers are emotions and sensations like anger, stress, feeling overwhelmed, vulnerable, abandoned, or out of control, loneliness, muscle tension, memories tied to a traumatic event, pain, or sadness. Now, the other type of trigger is an external trigger. This type is often more tangible and concrete. Common external triggers include relational conflict or changes, bullying, a person that reminds you of a traumatic event, a specific time of day, certain sounds that remind you of a traumatic experience, significant dates such as holidays or anniversaries, going to a specific location that reminds you of a traumatic experience, smells connected with an experience. Think of the smell of the Mexican restaurant in the example of Lily and the bike accident, changes in routine, and interruptions in sleep patterns. Personally, an external trigger I recently identified was holidays. For years, I've noticed my anxiety build around holiday seasons. I'll recognize a pattern in myself of emotionally withdrawing, feeling more anxious, or feeling off without being able to pinpoint why. Only recently have I been able to make some connections between those off feelings during holidays like Christmas and Thanksgiving and some painful experiences that have happened on those days. Triggers are harmful because they disorient us. As Kobe Campbell describes, triggers make us feel like we're on fire when there is no flame. They are real, powerful, physiological reminders that we are carrying pain, even when we don't know what that pain is or want to acknowledge it. Understanding the biology of being triggered is so important, especially in communities of faith. I've often experienced spiritual leaders oversimplify and over-spiritualize the complex nature of triggers. Comments like, "get over it," or "just stop being triggered," can be deeply wounding, especially from someone in spiritual authority. The underlying assumption here is that these automatic biological responses to pain are somehow a reflection of one's faithfulness, morality, obedience, or trust in God, and this is not the case. Statements like these can also cloud the compassion and tenderness of Jesus, making it difficult to come to him, especially when we are triggered. I want you to know that God is not frustrated with you for being triggered. His response is one of compassion. He doesn't belittle or minimize your pain, but moves towards you with comfort and care. Your reactions and emotions, no matter how strong or seemingly uncontrollable, don't faze him. Rather, he meets each of us in our need and demonstrates that our suffering is deeply personal to him. Listen to what the psalmist writes in Psalm 34:18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed." I love how the Message paraphrases this verse. If your heart is broken, you'll find God right there. If you're kicked in the gut, he'll help you catch your breath. Triggers can often feel like you got kicked in the gut, and you can feel doubled over as if you're trying to catch your breath. In these moments, God doesn't stand at a distance, but is right there, breathing with you. He knows what triggers feel like because he created our bodies, and he knows every detail of them. So in closing, I want to end with this. Triggers take us back to the most wounded and fearful versions of ourselves. They can bring up emotions that we are least acquainted with and remind us that there are parts of us that are still screaming in pain. But every time we experience a trigger, we are also being invited to deeper healing and wholeness, oftentimes in areas that we didn't even realize were wounded. Engaging with triggers well begins with listening to our bodies. When we are triggered, our bodies are telling us important things that will help us heal. Listen to what author and therapist KJ Ramsey says about this in her book, The Lord is My Courage. Often our bodies are speaking what our minds are afraid to say, stories most of us have never had space to tell. The tales our bodies tell through our sensations reveal our deepest wounds, truths, and hopes. So the next time you're triggered, I want to invite you to pause and listen. Consider the trigger, notice what's happening around you, and pay attention to how your body responds. What negative core belief might this trigger be validating inside of you? What part of you might be hurting? And where do you envision God in proximity to you? Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy. If this conversation was helpful and you'd like more information about my other offerings to engage your story more deeply, check out my website, taylorjoymurray.co.